just wanted to transition because me and Aaron were talking about transitioning to the Russia hysteria and also the Navalny story. And I wanted to do it by relating an incident, something I experienced here. There was Nicolas Maduro held a press conference after the election, and me and Anya and Zoe Pepper from People's Dispatch and a few other journalists who had come here to cover the elections. We, Elijah Magnier, we got, who's a friend of the show and friend of the Grayzone. We got in. Zoe got to ask a question about a flight of delegates which was held up by the Colombian government. They were not giving it overflight rights to go to Mexico, and so they had a really grueling experience. This is something the Colombian government always does to Venezuelan flights. And I got to talk to some of the journalists, not out of my own will, who are part of the hack pack here, who are like the mainstream corporate US journalists who get to run around here doing whatever they want, basically constantly indicting the government as like the worst Hitlerian, authoritarian, totalitarian dictatorship in Latin American history, with Colombia just a few hundred miles away. And one of them just came up and started talking to us because we're standing in the corner. They have their little hack pack. They all know each other. They all hang out together. They have their own little social world, their social bubble that insulates them from reality. And this guy came up to us, guy from Washington, D.C. He said, "Hey, so you're new in town?" Like, it's like a pickup line in like a cheesy bar, like at the happy hour or something at Studebaker's. And he starts talking, asking probing questions and stuff. And I said, I don't want to like name him or his publication just because it was like semi off the record, I guess. But I was just like, everything that you guys write, it just reads like a press release for the CIA or State Department. Why is that? And his voice started cracking. And I said, and he said, I think that's unfair. And I said, really, how is it unfair? When have you? No, actually, he said, I agree with a lot of what the State Department says. That was his response to me in a cracking voice. And I said, I just kept pushing. And I said, why don't you ever report on the impact of sanctions on civilians in Venezuela? Like, why don't you report on what the U.S. is doing here? All you do is run around saying everybody's corrupt, everything is mismanagement. And meanwhile, the U.S. is like holding this medieval siege, sanctioning even the CLAP program, which provides people with food. And he says to me, well, it's just really hard to do because you just don't know where the effects are and whether sanctions are at fault, which was just preposterous. I mean, preposterous. And then he said, what it really is mismanagement and corruption. It's just corruption. I said, really? Is that why oil output is decreasing? It isn't that the U.S. is literally seizing ships, and preventing fuel from coming in. And he's like, well, I covered the oil industry for years, and they can't fix anything. They don't, and he's just rattling off the kind of colonial narrative. And, then I watched the press conference take place, and these reporters, they pop up like one after another, like cuckoo clock, like neocon cuckoo clocks in Espanol, hammering Maduro. Do you have FARC agents in the country? Sir, are you really a socialist if you're doing the anti-blockade law? Just any way they could indict him. And then, Maduro obviously revels in this. And then he would go off for like a half hour for each question, just like smashing each question into the ground over and over, and then burying a new grave for the question, and then like hydrofracking the question into the molten core of the earth until he was done destroying the narrative, because he's on national TV. But it was just so obvious. I mean, CNN Espanol was there, all the wires were there, all your favorite corporate outlets were there, and it was just so obvious what they were, which is a bunch of mercenaries who are basically, they see themselves as these kind of agents of the American bipartisan foreign policy establishment who are here to carry out its wishes. And they get access in many cases that like a U.S. intelligence operative could not get. That's why so many intelligence operatives go under journalistic cover. You know, you can't just have some American guy looking like Jack Ryan walking around Petare or some barrio asking people questions about where did the money go for this community program that Chavistas are paying for? Like, did it disappear? So you have a reporter and then they flash their press pass. It's legitimate. And this isn't just unique to Venezuela. It's something we just saw take place on a really ridiculous level in Russia with Clarissa Ward from CNN, who we've reported on, supposedly going to the door of an FSB master assassin who happened to be living in like this like rancid apartment in the outskirts of Moscow. I mean, they don't treat their master assassins very well there. He's an FSB agent who supposedly poisoned Navalny, and she went to his door. I wish you could play the video, but she starts speaking to him in like crappy Russian. Not that my Russian is good. And then it's so funny. Then she breaks back into her English, but it was like Katie's Russian accent, her English. Like she suddenly was speaking English with a Russian accent. And, you know, then she gets out of the country and everyone's patting her on the back. And it was part of a coordinated operation with Bellingcat, who Aaron had talked about before, and we'll talk about now. These are, I just don't see these as journalists. Right now, there's an active campaign, very aggressive campaign to box Biden in to a hardcore anti-Russian position. It won't be hard to do with the kind of fanatics around him like Michael Carpenter, who will be like his assistant secretary of state for Eastern Europe and is like in with Ukrainian nationalists. It won't be hard to do with Biden's pre-existing positions, but they want to assure a continuum between the Russia hysteria of Trump, starting with, you know, Russiagate and the January 2017 ODNI report, going to today, where you have the Russia hack that's completely unproven, with the ODNI just basically saying it happened, FireEye was hacked, and the whole like this whole like industry has been penetrated. The Intercept has a story out today sourcing like Microsoft threat intelligence on Austin City infrastructure being penetrated by the FSB, and they made up some new name like Crazy Bear or something, Gummy Bear, like FSB operatives. And then you got the Bellingcat CNN investigation on Navalny. It's just like this coordinated avalanche of anti-Russian stories. And Biden finally responded and said, like, or somebody, like whoever is like in the hamster wheel of his brain, like pumping out statements, said, you know, we will punish those responsible. So what we're witnessing right now is journalism being used as essentially a weapon of the American intelligence apparatus on so many different levels in order to create a scenario in countries where it seeks regime change, where the U.S. government and the U.S. public feel compelled to do something and to continue escalating against these governments.
I do, and it's been surreal to witness. I'm going to make fun of myself a little bit because I think it's so funny. After the Mueller report failed, after all that, I wrote this tweet sort of expressing some optimism towards a new resistance. Basically, after the Mueller report, I wrote, with Mueller done, we are in a new era where the Trump-Russia conspiracy theory is no longer sustainable and thus no longer able to define the resistance. That's a crushing defeat for those who peddled it. But for the rest of us, it's a victory. We can now have a real opposition. So I wrote that in March 2019. How naive and stupid was that? Thinking that like any of this Russia madness would cease. It's only really intensified. And now this is the latest manifestation. And it's crazy to see, you know, journalists foaming at the mouth for some sort of retaliatory action against Russia, even though, of course, no one says with any confidence and can say with any confidence that Russia even carried out this cyber hack. I mean, personally, if it turns out to be Russia, I wouldn't actually be surprised. I mean, this is the kind of cyber espionage that states do. When we do it, we openly brag about it. You know, when we destroy centrifuges in Iran, or when we place malware inside of the Russian energy grid. There was a big New York Times story about that about a year ago, about how we had planted all this malware in there and can set it off if we wanted to. We could knock out power to ordinary Russians if we wanted to. So I wouldn't be surprised if Russia has done this, but it's so crazy. No matter how many times intelligence deceptions have been exposed, whether it's on Russiagate or before that with Iraq, it's just people just reflexively parrot the claim. And in the case of Bellingcat and their role in the Navalny story, just you have newspapers mindlessly parroting Bellingcat, and no one ever can even acknowledge the simple fact that they're funded by the same states that see Russia as a geopolitical foe. They're funded by the US, by Britain, by other NATO member states. And the craziest thing came with the Navalny story. So again, it's like Bellingcat says that because they got phone data and records, they were able to trace the route of alleged Russian agents who followed Navalny, and that these agents also had some kind of expertise in chemical warfare. Although how they know that, I don't know, and how they can actually make this attribution that these guys are Russian agents, I don't know either. And also how they even can really know that this metadata really belongs to them, again, is unknown. But Putin even indicated that, yeah, we might have agents following Navalny, as we would. I mean, he's like they suspected him of being involved with foreign intelligence, and so it would make sense for him to be tailed. And also, he's a prominent figure, so they might just want to have someone following him to keep an eye on anybody who might want to harm him. But then to make the
popular.
Well, yeah, that which is another thing. But then to make the conclusion that he was poisoned by these agents and Clarissa Ward can just show up at the door of one of the masterminds, everyone's relying on Bellingcat. And even though, and the New York Times just acknowledged this week, that months ago, right after Navalny was allegedly poisoned and brought to Germany, that it was the CIA and the MI6 which handed over the details to Germany that supposedly confirmed that it was Russia doing it. And now the New York Times reports it, and the reporter who does it, who reported this, I think, huge revelation, he says that Bellingcat's report squares up with what the CIA and MI6 told the German government. And Max, you pointed this out, that instead of raising automatic questions, well, if this CIA and MI6 aligned and state-funded outlet is now parroting the same claims that these intelligence agencies made months ago, that should raise suspicions about what we're hearing. Instead, it's treated as confirmation of what the CIA and MI6 told Germany months ago. And no one even can acknowledge it. It's like we're supposed to just reflexively accept literally state-funded outlets. And imagine if we were taking, on faith without any skepticism, what a Russian-funded outlet was saying or a Venezuelan-funded outlet. We'd get called on it. But when it's done by our own government, everyone just takes it as a fact and doesn't even acknowledge the provenance of the claim, which is Bellingcat is a state-funded source. It's like it's literally the free press acting completely as a vehicle for state media.
It's not only that, it's that Bellingcat has a specific function that it was set up to perform, and it is sort of a vanguard of a new kind of media operation that works hand in glove with Western intelligence in order to basically publicize certain findings that would not have the same credibility if, for example, the CIA or the Director of National Intelligence came out and declared it. And this all stems from the Iraq War, when what is popularly known as the deep state, the military and industrial complex, the military intelligence apparatus experienced a crisis in credibility because it all got together behind Bush's political team, the neocons in the Pentagon, with one voice and declared that Iraq had WMD, the US had to invade. And then you got all these veterans not walking around because they often have no legs. And it was a complete catastrophe. And so Cass Sunstein, the husband of Samantha Power, who is being proposed as the next director of the traditional CIA front, USAID, Cass Sunstein, in his notorious paper about conspiracy theories, actually proposed that the government create an outlet in order to combat what he called conspiracy theories, but which actually is sort of like dissenting opinion. He just uses conspiracy theory as a byword for dissenting opinions. and that the government can't come out and condemn these dissenting opinions. So it needs to give a nudge or prod a seemingly independent outlet that has credibility to do so. So look at the trajectory of Bellingcat from Syria, all of the media attention it's gotten, all these fancy and bogus awards. I don't even know where these media awards come from. It's basically just become the sort of golden boy of Western media, while it is clearly acting as a clearinghouse for the Western intelligence apparatus. So it wasn't just here with the Navalny situation where it obtained data and call logs and metadata from, I mean, where would they get that from, of these FSB agents? And then they used they say they're an open source website, but they only used open source to sort of geolocate these agents after obtaining all of this information from unknown sources. This would be something that I would think the MI6 would want to establish. But if Bellingcat could go out and just establish this on its own and get all that data, get all those call logs on its own, completely independent of any government government entity, what would be the point of the MI6? Why, they could just pack up and go home. They already have something that's even better, and it's out there, and it has much more credibility than, you know, this spooky, opaque apparatus. So it's obvious what's going on here. It was obvious in the Salisbury case, the poisoning of Sergei Skripal, where after this bizarre incident, when we still don't know where the Skripals are, Bellingcat emerges with passport info. I don't know what did they do? Go and like break into the migration offices of the UK like security state? No, they straight up got the passports of these two mysterious Russians who entered Salisbury and left on the day that Sergei Skripal was poisoned. We don't know who they are. They could be working for the mafia. We don't totally know exactly what their agenda was, but they got those passports, and they were basically used as the publicity arm of the British state to get that out there with more credibility than the New York Times does this, and the New Yorker does this big feature on them. Bellingcat broke the story and is taking the fight to Putin. It's the same thing with the MH17 investigation, where they're constantly attacking all of the dissident reporters in the Netherlands, who are very few and far in between, because if you think our media is conformist, European media, Northern European media, it's like unbelievable what happens to dissenting reporters. But they roll out attacks. They've been rolling out attacks on one publication, which is telling presenting an alternative narrative to the MH17 attack, trying to link them to the FSB, and they have call logs and all sorts of internal communications. And how did they get that? Well, Bellingcat sources it to a group of hackers called Black Mirror. Who the hell is Black Mirror? I mean, how do we know that that's not the CIA version of Fancy Bear? So, I mean, I could just keep making this point again and again and again. This is not an independent outlet. It is, I mean, you can, and it's clear, Aaron, you make the point again and again. They're funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. Look at all those other weird funders like Adesium. What the hell is Adesium? There are all these Dutch foundations which are basically being used as cutouts, or the Dutch postcode lottery, which was itself funded by the Clinton Foundation, in order to get Bellingcat into The Hague so they can then be the investigative arm that's supposedly independent of the state to investigate Syrian war crimes. Of course, only war crimes committed by the Syrian government. So this is how journalism is going to function in the future. I mean, you could call it spookalism. I don't know what you want to call them, journospooks. And journalists who perform this role will be consistently rewarded. And those of us who, try to break the media blockade. That's what I think our mission is at the Grayzone, is to break the media blockade and go to places like Venezuela and show the other side of the story. Those of us who do that, we will be called Russian. What did Josh Fox say? Russian infiltrators. That's the price we will pay. But I think it's becoming increasingly clear that everything that Bellingcat and Elliot Higgins have accused us of doing falsely, they are actually doing.
You know, the irony of so many corporate media outlets just blindly trusting Bellingcat is that even Bellingcat's own state funders have privately expressed doubts about them. I want to read this quote. It's from the Integrity Initiative, which is an intelligence operation run by the British government. Max, you've done a lot of reporting on it. And there was this leaked internal assessment. And there's been a trove of leaks from the British government when it comes to their information warfare, especially around Syria, which, Ben, you've covered, and we did a segment on it. But Integrity Initiative was put out this, I did this long document looking at all the potential partners it had to basically push British and Western propaganda. And they wrote this about Bellingcat. They say, quote, Bellingcat was somewhat discredited, both by spreading disinformation itself and by being willing to produce reports for anyone willing to pay. Like, what a perfect description of Bellingcat that, of course, is made privately, and we only got because it was leaked. But contrast to how they're treated in public, where, there was this fawning article about them in the New York Times where, talking about how they're digital Sherlocks, solving war crimes cases. Of course, didn't mention their state funding. The one interesting revelation in it was an article that revealed that Elliot Higgins himself credits his craft not to having expertise, but to playing video games. That's where I learned about, Elliot Higgins' real credentials in playing video games. But that even privately, their own funders say that they're discredited and basically willing to peddle disinformation. It's unbelievable, but it doesn't make a dent. And what also doesn't make a dent is literally when they get caught. We just outed them at the Grayzone a month ago when they published this scam. It was a straight up scam trying to discredit one of the OPCW whistleblowers. First of all, they doxed him. They revealed his name. And his name is Dr. Brendan Whelan, and he's one of the two inspectors who we know about who challenged internally the cover-up of the Duma investigation, the investigation into an alleged chemical weapons attack in April 2018 in Syria. And so Bellingcat published this article where they doxed Dr. Whelan, and they also published this, what they said was a letter that Whelan received from the OPCW. And they said that this letter basically demolished all of Whelan's objections to the cover-up of his probe. And they said that Whelan basically has hid all of this, or if journalists have been leaked stuff and we happen to get this letter, that means that we're complicit in hiding this damning letter too, that sort of disproves all of the whistleblowers' claims and vindicates the OPCW investigation. The problem with it was, as we exposed, was that this letter was a fake. It was never sent to Whelan. And we sent the actual letter that Whelan was sent, and it contained none of the claims that Bellingcat published on its website, pretending that they had some real letter. So they get caught in a straight up scam. It's a farce, all the more so because the contents of this fake letter that they say disprove Whelan were a joke, and we showed why. But yet, we have fun with it and we laugh at it, and it, obviously it made a dent on social media. But no other outlets that are simultaneously parroting Bellingcat's stories even acknowledge it, even though they get caught in a scam. It's like, so obviously there's there has to be, it's not just media people being credulous. There has to be some influence behind the scenes, I think, we don't know about it, as you talked about, Max, that is backing these people and is telling people that, right, you have to cite them and pretend that they're a serious source.
Well, first of all, I mean, just on the Navalny poisoning, I don't doubt that there are FSB agents following him around. Do we know that they poisoned him? Does the Bellingcat investigation demonstrate that they poisoned him? No, it just creates this kind of narrative that he was being followed by the FSB, so must have been poisoned by them. And then showing up at his door was just a way of getting people to pay attention. And, why would they want to do that now? It's just, it just is so obvious what is taking place. And even in Venezuela, Bellingcat is active. Why? Well, because they're in Venezuela, because the U.S. wants regime change in Venezuela. So they're active. So Bellingcat hired an actual Venezuelan opposition member. I forget his name off the top right now. He does trainings on the Colombian side of the border. In Colombia, he does trainings for Venezuelans. Obviously, it's anti-government activity. It's the kind of training sessions that the National Endowment for Democracy would do with students and activists. And they recently did, well, earlier this year, they did an investigation that was kind of similar to the recent Bellingcat one on the FSB agents in Navalny, where they tracked Venezuelan government officials who were working with someone named Alex Saab, who is a Venezuelan businessman and government official who was in charge of trying to secure food deals in order to keep the CLAP program going, in order to keep Venezuelans fed, 3 million families fed under sanctions. Saab was subsequently kidnapped by the United States, which manipulated the Interpol program. And he was, according to himself, tortured into confession. He never made the confession, but he said they tortured him into attempting to confess to some vast corruption scheme. But the U.S. always says CLAP is corrupt. It's just they don't want CLAP to be there because it's keeping people, it's preventing society-wide chaos. So in steps Bellingcat to just geolocate Alex Saab's underlings in Spain in various areas to create this sense that they're doing something criminal. Although if you read the article, you can't really understand why it's significant that they're being geolocated. It's just kind of like, why is this happening? So Bellingcat's active there. There's no reason it wouldn't be active there if there weren't some powerful interests saying, let's get some action on Venezuela. And I don't know if you remember when Elliot Higgins said, I wish we had the financial resources to do something on Yemen. And it was only after, I think, like MBS, Mohammed Bonesaw, had like his minions cut Jamal Khashoggi into pieces. Jamal Khashoggi was obviously a CIA asset that Bellingcat snapped into action and started doing something on Yemen. So I just can't make the point enough. And someday, I believe someday, some mainstream person, some like Eric Wemple type character will finally, although he's like puffed Bellingcat too, like they all love it. They love like these little nerds with their keyboards are cracking the code on Putin and breaking his three-dimensional chess apart. And journalists love like Revenge of the Nerds plots because they all were like abused in high school. It's why so many of them are like, it's why so many of like these like nerd journalists are like turning into like, they're turning like anti-woke because they like, like a black student said something mean to them in high school or something. So now they're like getting revenge. It's like every Zed Jelani tweet is like a Revenge of the Nerds sequel. But anyway, so this is what's going on. And there will be an article someday, but right now the institutional pressure inside media outlets is so extreme in support of what Bellingcat is doing. And there is a deep conviction, a deep ideological conviction among the staff of the New York Times, which like had like some like revolt against Tom Cotton's like Black Lives Matter commentary, but won't like have a revolt on him calling to like nuke Iran. But the staff of the New York Times, especially the editors, the higher ups, the people who write the op-eds condemning Venezuela's elections and reciting all of the regime change propaganda, they deeply believe in what they're doing. They deeply believe in the mission of Bellingcat. That is why one of the original members of the Bellingcat open source team, Christian Trebert, was hired by the New York Times to lead its video investigations unit. The New York Times and Bellingcat are basically linked at the hip, and so is The Intercept, which has paid Bellingcat enormous fees for training sessions. And I mean, Elliot Higgins has boasted that The Intercept funds his operation. Training sessions with Bellingcat cost like $2,500 a person. It's a major source of revenue along with the state and cutout sources that you mentioned. And they're not obviously alone in doing what they're doing. They're just kind of the most prominent ones.
And meanwhile, of course, The Intercept, as I've enjoyed pointing out whenever I can, The Intercept is yet to acknowledge the existence of the OPCW whistleblowers. After pushing the pro-war Trump line on Duma via columnists like Robert Mackey, and then they published this long investigation by this British journalist, James Harkin, who actually works with Bellingcat. And that was...
I didn't know that.
Yeah. But that was interesting because at that point, I think more evidence had emerged about staging, about the scene at the hospital in Duma being staged. Riam Dalati, the BBC producer, was working on that. And I think it became impossible to deny certain aspects of this just being phony. So Harkin's article in The Intercept was interesting. This is in early 2019. He acknowledges and he reports that the Duma hospital scene was staged and talks about the manipulation of the scene. He talks about the white helmets being involved. But then he goes on to still conclude that there was a chlorine gas attack in Duma. So basically there was, according to his theory, there was a chlorine gas attack by the Syrian government. But then the activists on the ground decided to take advantage for visual effect by staging some scenes. And it doesn't occur to him, or maybe it did occur to him, but he just, he was aiming to dismiss this possibility, that if one scene is being staged, then that raises questions, obviously, about what else is being staged. But he doesn't really explore that. And then a few months later, the first leaks came out from the OPCW showing that the actual investigators had found evidence that this was staged, did not find evidence for this being a chemical attack by the Syrian government. And since that point, The Intercept has yet to acknowledge their existence, while having previously worked with a NED-funded organization that has put a key role in the fraud. They haven't just doxed one of the whistleblowers and put out fake articles about him, but they published a series of articles trying to justify the ridiculous claims that are made in the official OPCW reports, and they've tried to undermine the claims that were made in the original OPCW reports by the actual team that went to Duma, but had their evidence suppressed. And the latest phase of this, and we should talk about this briefly, Max, was that BBC podcast Mayday, which was this multi-part attempt to rehabilitate the image of James LeMessurier, the late founder of the White Helmet. And they throw in this extra episode about the Duma incident for some reason. And it's clearly an attempt to denigrate the whistleblowers, also to denigrate Jose Bustani, the former OPCW Director General who we've interviewed, who has spoken out in support of them and wanted to speak in defense of them at the UN Security Council, but got blocked by the US and its allies. And this episode relies on this anonymous source who the host, Chloe Hadamaju, claims that she just tracked down somehow. And they say that he works for the OPCW. They don't say in what capacity. They don't even say whether he was actually a member of the Duma investigation, although at one point he says something that makes me think he wasn't. He talks about the team on the ground in Duma, and he refers to them as they, suggesting that he was not among them. And it's like, where does this come from? Where does this OPCW source come from? And how did the BBC get connected with him? And then you have the fact that he's also recycling the exact same claims that Bellingcat made in its phony attack that we debunked. There's two main things. One is that there's a smoking gun chemical that supposedly proves a chlorine gas attack. The problem with that, as we showed in our article, is that that claim is contradicted by the OPCW's own final report. And then they make the even dumber claim that Russia and Syria secretly admitted to guilt, that they actually accepted all the report's findings, which is just not true, and we showed how. So this BBC article recycles Bellingcat's debunked claims, which says to me that the same people were behind all that. And there's one more piece to this, which is, I haven't written about this yet for the Grayzone, but I will, which is that before Bellingcat did this, their hoax, it was actually first attempted by a reporter who you guys have written about, Chris York, at the Huffington Post, where months before the Bellingcat scam, Chris York wrote WikiLeaks with a almost identical set of questions as Bellingcat months later sent to WikiLeaks and people like me. So the language is almost the same. And Chris York said he was close to publishing. He had this document, this letter that undermined Dr. Whelan's claims, but Chris York never did it. And then 2 months later, it showed up at Bellingcat. And that's like part of a pattern, I think, where, scams that intelligence operatives want to pull off that they can't get into, official news outlets, are then pawned off to Bellingcat months later. When, for whatever, I don't know why Chris York didn't go ahead with the article, because he had it first and he refused to answer my questions. But it's interesting that before Bellingcat published it, he had it first, and he ultimately, for some reason, I don't know, he didn't publish it.
Yeah, Ben, you wrote that piece. I don't know if you want to weigh in.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll get this piece back up for people watching. At Huffington Post UK, there's an interesting system in the UK where, well, so this piece, it's Huffington Post UK editor works with government censorship program while smearing anti-war scholars as tools of Russia. And Aaron mentioned this Huffington Post UK reporter, Chris York, who focuses a lot on Syria. And he published this article titled, "The Useful Idiots, How These British Academics Helped Russia Deny War Crimes at the UN." And this was actually the 12th piece that they published attacking this very small group of academics. So they're extremely obsessed with this small group of people. I mean, again, it gets back to the point we were saying earlier with Jimmy Dore about how they always attack us and say that we're fringe and irrelevant, but then they simultaneously act as though we're all powerful and spend so much time trying to debunk our factual journalism. Well, what's interesting about this is that Chris York's boss at Huffington Post UK, named Jess Brammer, she actually works voluntarily with a UK government program. And I should mention that in a kind of comedic irony, right after we published this article showing how this Huffington Post UK editor works with a British government censorship program, hours later, she was actually promoted from executive editor to editor-in-chief of Huffington Post UK. But she's a member, as you can see in this article here, of what's called the Defense and Security Media Advisory Committee, DSMA. It's also known as the D-Notice Committee. And this is a group of people. I mean, you can find, here's a list of some of the people who were involved. There are government members who are from the Home Office, the Foreign Office, and then the Ministry of Defense in the UK. And then there are top members of the media who voluntarily join this British government group helmed by the Defense Ministry and that censor journalism in the interest of the British government when it supposedly challenges national security. You can see Jess Bremer here. You can also see people from the Press Association, from the Daily Mail, from other websites. I mean, it's like the leading members of the British Media Corps, the British Press Corps, work in this censorship program, which again is voluntary. And then finally, another quick point that I was going to mention earlier, which is related to all this stuff. I mean, Max was talking about these reporters who have just a revolving door with intelligence agencies. They don't even do journalism. All they do is they get fed press releases and scoops by the intelligence agencies. They don't actually dig it up themselves. And we saw another example of this week. This is a tweet from Ali Abunima, and he pointed out that Reuters just hired Anderson Cooper, who was at CNN. He interned for 2 summers at the CIA. And by the way, he interned for 1 summer and then he came back a year later. So you could jokingly call him the unpaid intern for the CIA, because that's basically what his journalism is. But in this case, this is not someone who interned at the CIA. Reuters just hired someone who worked at the CIA for 33 years. And of course, why did they hire Miss Scalici? And it's to quote, meet the disparate needs of the US government. So we have an open example of major media outlets hiring CIA analysts. I should also mention that Reuters during the first Cold War in the 1970s was funded by the British government. And what specific institution? By the British government's anti-Soviet propaganda unit. So it's not in any way speculation or hyperbole to say that media outlets, not just in the United States, but in Western European countries, not only openly collaborate with intelligence agencies, not only hire spies and spooks, they're funded by Western government agencies and anti-foe. In that case, anti-Soviet, you can bet today, anti-Russian and anti-Chinese propaganda units from those states.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, Dawn Scalisi is also she was also hired by McKinsey and Associates, the former home of Pete Buttigieg, CIA Pete. But you just take a look at anything Reuters publishes about Venezuela, it's just like a straight up press release, or it functions in the same role as if the CIA issued a press release, and they'll often refer to like internal PDVSA documents. So how do they have a source inside the state oil company who's like an asset, who's just feeding them documents so that they can tell the public, which has very little interest in this, that Venezuela is still managing to export oil. But they're not saying, you know, why is it an issue that they are not allowed to export oil? And what does that do to its population? So the effect of this kind of management, I mean, I call it really, like I wrote a book called The Management of Savagery. This is the management of democracy. These hands are slipped in to media institutions and other institutions in order to fulfill the recommendations. And it's not some conspiracy. I'm not saying like they're reading this book and then acting it out. It's just how the security state functions. But the recommendations put forward by Samuel Huntington in his book, The Crisis of Democracy, where he actually calls explicitly for the de-democratization of the American workplace and media through, you know, essentially great propaganda, managing society much more carefully, because in the 1960s and early 70s, democracy exploded, and there was what he called an excess of democracy. And so now, as the U.S. lurches into a new Cold War against the wishes of most of its population, which is receiving next to nothing from its government, a new Cold War with Russia and China, which the U.S. absolutely initiated along with its allies, the pressure for managing democracy and suppressing dissenting opinions, narratives, and factual reporting is going to grow more extreme. That's why we're seeing so much management of Silicon Valley, which is just essentially intertwined with the U.S. intelligence apparatus of social media, suppression on social media. But there's also what you mentioned, Ben, the D-Notice, which is a longstanding practice of the British security state. And it can be imposed in an unofficial way in the U.S. With a phone call to an editor. After the Skripal poisoning, there was a D-Notice imposed on the entire British media to prevent them from mentioning the name of his MI6 handler, Pablo Miller. Pablo Miller was later revealed to be involved in the Integrity Initiative, this secret British military intelligence troll farm, which was exposed by hackers. And he was also revealed to be a business associate of none other than Christopher Steele at Orbis Intelligence. So there were a lot of just strange connections there that illuminated the intrigue behind this poisoning that the British state actively suppressed. And you have people like Jess Brammer, Chris York's editor, participating in that program. This is about basically preventing the excess of democracy from coming to bear.
Yeah, and I should also mention, Max mentioned the Trilateral Commission. Well, you know who's also a current member of the Trilateral?
You did not.
I did not.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned Samuel Huntington, and Samuel Huntington.
Okay, well, I think that was
for the Trilateral Commission. Head. Samuel Huntington, the kind of conservative Harvard political scientist, he is most famous for writing the book The Clash of Civilizations, but he also, in the 1970s, he co-published this report, The Crisis of Democracy, in which the Trilateral Commission called for curtailing democracy. That's what Max was acknowledging there. They said that there was a crisis of democracy, and that crisis was there was too much democracy in the United States and in Western Europe. And you know who's currently a member of that same institution, the Trilateral Commission? Well, the new labor leader, Keir Starmer. As Matt Kennard, a friend of ours, a great reporter, he published for us at the Grayzone. So, I mean, these same institutions that during the first Cold War were actively involved in campaigns to, in their own words, curtail democracy, are still involved today. And I think it's fair to assume that they're still involved in curtailing democracy. It's not a stretch.
And Starmer was also the prosecutor of Assange. I mean, that article, it's so important. That's such an important article by Kennard because it illustrates what Starmer's real purpose is. He is just essentially a sort of like a marionette for the British security services to reimpose control over the Labour Party after Corbyn brought in 100,000 new members. It's exactly what we're talking about. Jeremy Corbyn represented the excess of democracy, and through the management team into crisis. In comes Starmer, someone we've never heard of. He's got all the charisma of a filing cabinet. He's, there's nothing compelling about him at all. And Kennard unearthed all of these meetings that Starmer was having with Eric Holder. They were obviously talking about Assange. He was the point man. He's gotten really quickly to be fast friends with the Israel lobby, the new British ambassador from Israel, Sippy Hotovely. She's like someone who's considered a straight up fascist in Israel. She was part of the Orange Cell that tried to fight the removal of settlers, the most fanatical settlers from the Gaza Strip. I mean, she's from the far right fringe, and she's someone that Keir Starmer's palling around with after signing off on the fake anti-Semitism campaign on Corbyn. So what you have essentially is someone in charge of the Labour Party who is he? I mean, what does he represent? We know who Boris Johnson is. Boris Johnson is like someone who rose to, obviously he represents many of the same interests, but he's also sort of an independent politician who has his own personality and charisma and base. Who is Keir Starmer? What's going on here? He's just a face for the management team. And I think we're facing a similar scenario going forward in the US with Biden. Biden has demonstrated some independence. I don't want to like give him too much credit, but he did oppose the Libya intervention along with Bob Gates, who said it was the backbenchers in the Obama administration, the 30 and 40 somethings who were all into like human rights, R2P interventionism, who thought we have to do something to support the Arab Spring. So let's go like bomb Libya into oblivion. Biden had challenged the Pentagon. He came out on the Afghanistan surge, and ultimately he caved. He also caved on Libya. And as Aaron has pointed out again and again, Biden actually called out Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey for supporting Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. He said this at a Harvard Kennedy School event. And then for the next few days, he went on a kind of like a global apology tour. Like, I'm sorry. I just really want to apologize to ISIS's patrons because, this is what I have to do. That's Biden's way. And he'll cave again. And then you have Kamala Harris, who, I mean, she's the new pancake lady. Like George H.W. Bush said of Bill Clinton, his foreign policy experience is limited to having breakfast at the International House of Pancakes. So I say like Kamala Harris is like the pancake lady. Like she went to IHOP and now she's getting the script from the security state and the State Department, and she will adhere to it faithfully. And she will be a driving force in the Biden administration by the sheer fact that she has actual vitality while Biden is fading off into oblivion. What they aim to do is to establish a kind of one-party state where Republicans and Democrats exchange power, but a figure like Trump or Bernie can never enter office. I mean, Jamie Raskin actually proposed a vetting commission for presidential candidates that would include 15 members, 7 of whom will come from national security related positions, and they will vet if somebody, whether a candidate is fit to serve as president. So they're actually going to manage who can be elected president through a national security technocratic panel. That's what Jamie Raskin, who's considered a progressive Democrat, wanted. So I think whether we look at the Labor Party or the Democratic Party in the US, we're looking at a technocratic authoritarianism and possibly a good subject for a book called The Management of Democracy.
I think that's a good place for us to wrap or start to wrap. If I haven't kept track of all the super chats. I don't know if we've missed any questions, and if we have,
I can't see them.
You can't see me there, yes. So I apologize. But Max, one thing I wanted to ask you about. We mentioned this before, but I'm curious your comments. And obviously, Julian Assange is heavy on our minds right now. We're all hoping, a miracle of miracles, that he'll get a pardon from Trump. And you made a comment today on Twitter that I thought was so important, that Sarah Palin has come out with a stronger message of support for pardoning Assange than AOC. And, forgetting, AOC personally for a second, but just what that says about the state of the progressive left right now in the US, that there's a stronger support for Assange coming from a figure of the right, than from like a stalwart of the left, and just how, like, what that says about what's been done, like what's happened to the left.
Just look at the Twitter account of Stella Morris, who is the partner of Julian Assange. She's a person of the left. She's not a right winger. She was on his legal team. She comes from the left, and all she's doing all day for the most part is tweeting support from right-wing personalities. Not all, but disproportionately. And who is the one host? I mean, we make this point so many times, it's like becoming like a cliche, but who's the one host with a national audience willing to give her a platform and lobby for the release of Julian Assange and condemn the greatest attack on press freedom today in the West and in recent history? It's Tucker Carlson. I just can't even believe Sarah Palin. I was like, is this, it's definitely not Tina Fey, because she would never take such a position. But Sarah Palin, I just couldn't believe she was saying it. And she made it plain. Like, she gave a very clear analysis of what WikiLeaks was, why it's valuable to the public, and why this full-scale security state assault on the free press and Julian Assange specifically should end. And then you look at AOC's response to Jeremy Scahill, and it's like word salad, and she can't make it plain. Malcolm X always said you have to make it plain in order to connect with people, to win people over. And I'm not making any connection beyond that to Sarah Palin, but it is just amazing to see in so many instances, whether it's Assange, any of these major foreign policy issues of the day that relate to like the full-scale attack on states, where states are fighting for national survival, and if they collapse, they will be like Libya or worse. You have this collection of progressive personalities who are beloved, and we're supposed to pin our hopes on, who cannot make it plain. They cannot condemn the crimes happening right in front of our eyes. They cannot come together and disrupt business as usual in Washington. They cannot disrupt the bipartisan imperial consensus. They will not do it. None of them did anything to protest Nancy Pelosi celebrating Juan Guaido. We don't see them doing anything like that. When I asked AOC about Venezuela, she ran away from me. She basically ran away. She was like frightened just to make a statement about it, because she's got so much ambition. I don't know what she wants to be, senator, president, but that's like the progressive future Ben Dixon was talking about when he referenced what AOC is trying to build. She's just basically like this ornament. Ben made the point earlier. She's just like this kind of saint that people are developing a secular religion around, or advancing their own ambitions through. And so then these left-wing pundits, the ones who've been attacking Jimmy, they can't make it plain either. In fact, they go in the opposite direction and just directly support Empire. And now, like Nomiki Konst is on Twitter still just having this complete meltdown because she got exposed for participating in the destruction of Africa by NATO. Like, she directly went there and participated, the US government sent her there through the NDI. And like, this is the great thing about what Jimmy's done, to wrap it all up, is he's lifted the mask on these people, shown all their contradictions, thrown them into contortions, shown that they just cannot plainly address the crimes happening in front of us and plainly answer the suffering of, whether it's the US public who they're supposed to represent, or the victims of the United States empire on the other side of the gun. They're just completely useless, and they're waiting for like some 15-year process down the line. That's why Jimmy has a big audience. They don't understand that. That's why like a lot of people will come in and fight back against these attacks on Jimmy, because he just comes in, makes it plain, and speaks for so many people. What he says is popular, and it's frightening to a lot of people like AOC that is popular. And I think we can say something similar about us, although what we do is maybe more niche. I think what I've found since starting the Grayzone and taking it out of Alternet is we're speaking for people who have felt abandoned by Western media. And so that's what we're just going to continue to do. And we're not going to pull any punches.